This is St. Petersburg, a golden land, attracting millions each year for the multitudes of pleasant things to do.
When I started learning more about the history of the city, I was just completely amazed. I mean, everybody who was anyone during probably from late 1800s through the 1940s came to St. Petersburg or Florida in the wintertime. So we have such a rich history here that people don't realize the things that had happened here, that started here, that the folks that used to live here, and just the history of the city itself. The growth of the city, the salesmanship of the people, of the founding fathers of the city. And I tell my St. Pete history class that the city was built on smoke and mirrors, but basically it was. There's a lot of little white lies told about real estate deals here back in the day, but it was a lot of promotion, a lot of salesmanship, a lot of craziness. It was like a circus. That's what I mean, circus, to bring people there. But I think that we've had three major periods of growth in the city, and the first one came in the 1920s. So imagine downtown St. Petersburg between the years of 1922 and 1926. In 4 short years, everything was built. The Serena, massive hotels, the Vinoy, office buildings, banks. There was never a day in that 4-year period in St. Petersburg where you could walk downtown and didn't hear the sound of construction. It was crazy. The Great Depression put an end to that, and when the value of the land got overvalued, and people were stuck with tons of building on their hand in that time, even before the Depression started. So eventually, when the Depression started, it puts an end to that. The golden era of St. Pete was another major boom post-World War II in building, in everything, but it was completely different because the 1920s explosion in growth was based around building a city that was for rich tourists. They were building a city that people would come to and live here part of the year. So you'd get here right after Christmas or right after Thanksgiving, and you'd leave right after Easter. Everything in the 1920s that was built geared towards that. Hotels, restaurants, entertainment, the $1 Million Pier, the Coliseum, the theaters that were built, the Florida Theater, all the major theaters that were in downtown St. Pete at the time. So everything was aimed at nothing but pure, wealthy tourists. Before World War II, Florida was the least populated state in the South, as far as people is concerned. We had a lot of cows, a lot more cows than we did people. But World War II changed that because when the government realized it had to build a 10 million man army, it was going to cost them a fortune to build barracks, training facilities, and everything. And the Depression had decimated the whole Florida hotel tourism scene. So the folks in Tallahassee and all these major cities contacted the federal government and said, "Hey, we've got everything you need." So millions of soldiers came to Florida. Over 150,000 came to St. Petersburg alone. So from 1942 to 1944, we were a major training facility for the Army Air Corps and for the Merchant Marine, and they were all for a bunch of other people here. Bombers would take off from MacDill Field. Planes would take off from Albert Whitted. They'd take off from which is now St. Pete Clearwater Airport. We had all kinds of Navy ships in Bayberry Harbor. We would strafe and bomb Cabbage Key, which is Fort DeSoto, in training facilities. They would land in those big landing crafts and come running out on the beach. This is where they practiced. The Vinoy was the headquarters, was an Army headquarters. It wasn't open to the public for those years. So now imagine you're a soldier from Fargo, North Dakota, right? And you come to St. Petersburg in January and February 1943 to train. Go away, you fight, you beat the bad guys, you win the war, you save the world, which they did. And now you come back to your farm in Fargo, and it's 32 below zero, thinking, man, 3 years ago I was on the beach in St. Petersburg, Florida. They came back. by the thousands. They came back to Florida. So the growth, the golden age growth, was just that. It was families, it was people that were moving here to live here year round. So even though the growth of the 20s, dollar-wise, was probably more, it was because it was major hotels and things like that that were being built. But it wasn't, for permanent residents. This was a complete different growth. And it actually created St. Petersburg.
Basically, I think if you look at the importance of St. Petersburg and mass communication, St. Petersburg was a pioneer of mass communication and using it in a very advantageous way. From the 1920s, working with the newspaper publishers, the city worked in concert with them. In the 1940s, 1950s, and even into the 1960s, the city worked with media outlets that it either contracted with or photographers or others to try to promote the beauty of the city. St. Petersburg, after World War II, really goes through a big transition. Tourism was a big part of its history back since the 1920s, but it tried after World War II to use new forms of marketing. Long before television existed in this area, they were actually trying to use television in the late 1940s and early 1950s to bring people here. They were trying to market in a way to bring a whole new demographic. St. Petersburg would not be St. Petersburg without media and without having a lot of very forward-thinking media moguls who were involved in the planning of how St. Petersburg's message was going to be spun to the rest of the nation.
This is St. Petersburg in Pinellas County, Florida, famous throughout the world as the Sunshine City. Here, sunshine abounds throughout the year. It's fun to rest in the sunshine between shopping trips. Boating is a lot more fun in the sunshine, too. And of course, swimming in the sunshine brings out that nice Florida tan.
So what happens is during the 1950s and 1960s, the city took a very aggressive, forward-thinking marketing plan, and they were still targeting the older demographic. In the early part of the years right after World War II, 1947, 48, the city came on board with an advertising agency that began to market St. Petersburg. They started to make these films, 1947, 48, and through the early 50s, which talked about St. Petersburg as this retirement paradise, this tropical place to go to, a place where you could live in a very reasonable way.
On our way to the pier, that warm sun and the palm trees made it hard to believe that this was really the Christmas season.
Before there were any TV stations in Florida, the city of St. Petersburg had entered into an agreement to make these films to distribute to TV stations in the Northeast and Midwest that were used very well commercially.
I think Christmas is wonderful, but I was sure it would be better without the cold, unpleasant weather.
So we were off to Florida on this deluxe train, the Champion. The family next door, the Carrolls, had gone to St. Petersburg earlier. And since they wrote us about the wonderful time they were having, we decided to go there too. The kids made a game of memorizing the states as we whizzed along. Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, then Florida. And before we knew it, St. Petersburg.
There's a great quote that St. Petersburg was built on printer's ink. Others have said St. Petersburg is a city that marketing built. What that means is that the words that were written about St. Petersburg in the local press, that were communicated through the local media, that were distributed nationally, the goal was very clear. Bring people here, allow them to buy land, make this their retirement paradise, make it a place they want to live, make it a place they want to stay or vacation in, and it was very successful. St. Petersburg Times and the Evening Independent, which were two newspapers, the Times was the morning paper, the Evening Independent was the afternoon one. They both were very vigorous in marketing the city. They had different editors at the time. The Pointer family owned the Times from the early part of the 20th century. The Independent was owned by a guy named Lou Brown. Both newspapers kind of competed with one another to market the city in their own way, and both worked in hand in being successful in doing that. The Times was very active in promoting the city as a beautiful retirement mecca, as a place to move to, and loved to make lots of money off of advertisers from real estate companies. The St. Petersburg Times was really good about working with advertisers to promote the different subdivisions that were popping up all over the city and trying to get people to come here and stay. This is a newspaper called the St. Petersburg Daily News. It's not in the best of condition, but this was actually a newspaper that was published at the time that was kind of like a tourist newspaper that would talk about different things happening in Florida. The city was a place that tried to, and very successfully did, market itself as a place for people to come and have a second stab at life and then extend their life. Lou Brown, the longtime editor and publisher of the St. Petersburg Evening Independent, had what was called the Sunshine Offer. And what that was basically that the newspaper would be free Monday through Saturday when it was published if the sun didn't shine in St. Petersburg beforehand. So if you turn to the inside front page, he would actually keep track of the number of days since the paper was last given away. Now, I grew up in the beaches, on the Gulf beaches, and there were days where we never saw the sun, and I would go down and open the paper rack, and it was locked tight. So they must have been very cautious in how they judged that, but the Evening Independent used this as a great marketing tool. It's been 70 days or 120 days or 6 months since we last gave away a free newspaper, and that was something that promoted the city. So you have the newspapers working in concert with one another in some ways. You have radio and early media also promoting the beautiful nature of the city. And a lot of the words that got out to the rest of the country from writers locally talked about how this was a tropical paradise. You could live here or retire here on a very low budget. They didn't think about homeowners insurance or property insurance. There was no Citizens Insurance Company back then. Nobody talked like that. You could live quite well and quite inexpensively here back in the 1930s and 40s if you had a little bit of a means. It was a great place for retirement for the people that they were trying to target. Mostly whites from the Midwest and the Northeast and from other parts of the country, but not so much from the South. Whites from the Midwest and Northeast who were looking for either a wintertime residence or to possibly move down here and work down here in some of the jobs that were in the area. All cities have chambers of commerce. All cities try to promote themselves as a great destination. What makes St. Petersburg stand out among its peers during the years around and after World War II is how successful it was. It was so successful that it went from being a relatively small city on the map to being a very popular destination during the years from the 1940s until the 1990s. It became a place that people wanted to come to. A lot of the hyperbola and a lot of the words that people read about brought them here, and some of them stayed, and they're the ones that are driving slow on US 19 to the early bird dinners as we speak.
I'm not sure if I think it was after I had retired. At some point, History Press sent me an email and said, hey, you got anything else you'd like to write about? And I had two things, 1950s St. Pete and a history of the Evening Independent. And so they said, okay, let's do the 1950s St. Pete. Question is, does St. Petersburg offer any more of a good life than Sarasota or Fort Myers, back then Orlando, some of the small cities on the East Coast? The difference is that St. Petersburg has always had this very busy, very wonderful, very effective public relations machine. And it began in the 20s, and it picked up again right after World War II. So the idea of the good life was sold, whether it was any better than, for example, Sarasota or Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia. I'm sure people there can find the good life also. We just advertised better.
We would promote St. Petersburg as this place of warmth and sunshine, and it's 72 degrees year-round average temperature, and the sun shines 362 days a year, and it was cheap. There's no state income tax. You can come to St. Petersburg, property was cheap, property taxes were cheap, living here was cheap, so you could afford to build a home here and live here when you retire. And it became the Florida dream, the St. Petersburg dream, became the American dream. I mean, you work in a car factory, you know, outside of Detroit, Michigan, building Fords or whatever you're building, and you work all your life, and you know, you save your money, and then you know, after 25 years or whatever, you get your little golden watch and retire, and you retire to Florida. And that's what happened to St. Petersburg. The average age continued to grow, average resident age. The city got older. We just had an awful reputation during the 60s, not so much the 50s, mostly the late 60s, 70s, early 80s, where St. Petersburg was that, the place of the newlywed and nearly dead. And we became a retiree city.
There were young Turks in town that young professional men for the most part, but some women as well, were getting tired of hearing all the old jokes about St. Petersburg being a retirement boneyard, and so they deliberately set about trying to change the image. And it was pretty hard because St. Petersburg really had been a resort and then a retirement area for older people for a long time. And many of them lived right in the downtown area. These were all upstanding Chamber of Commerce and professional types who had I think it's called something like Project 62, I guess, basically for the year that it came into being. And so they wanted to do these different things. They had no qualms at all about the pier being torn down in the late 60s because they thought that was kind of an iconic place that appealed mostly to the older crowd.
They removed the green benches because it was the image of the old people sitting all winter long on the green benches just hanging out talking, and it was just this awful image of gray hair. And they thought of all kinds of things to do. They closed off Central Avenue and put big planters in the middle of it to make it a pedestrian street instead of traffic for cars. And there were just a lot of things that happened that they did to try and change that image, and it took a long time for it to change.
Johnny Carson, who was an early talk show host on The Tonight Show, he took over in the early 60s, used to hit St. Petersburg with a lot of jokes. Just like David Letterman used to make fun of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays back in the 90s and early 2000s, Johnny Carson would refer to St. Petersburg as God's waiting room, and other types of put-downs like that. Even before Carson took the stage at The Tonight Show, in 1960 the census looks at the population of St. Petersburg, and in the downtown districts, the average age is something like 65 or 66. City leaders realize that they're looking at a demographic nightmare, that a lot of the elderly who were there had very high care needs and didn't have family locally, and that they wanted to try to reinvent the city and make it younger. So during the 1960s, a lot of the green benches disappear, things become younger in that way. In 1954, when the Skyway opens up, the first Skyway bridge, what that does is it moves the traffic out of the downtown. So it makes the downtown not as important to people anymore. When the interstate's being built in the early 70s, it's also going to move traffic away from the downtown businesses.
Nationally, life was changing. We'd all been through the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the episode that came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, a few months before. We'd experienced in 1963 a young president's assassination. Life was changing in the U.S. and people were beginning to have a little bit of a different worldview, just as St. Pete, in a microcosmic kind of a way, was also beginning to look at itself in a different way. We were still a couple of years away from the real counterculture movement that kind of kicked in maybe 1965, 66, 67 with the Summer of Love and all of that, but it seemed 63 seemed a good place to end it. As you may well know, has had a long history with piers on the waterfront. Of course, there was $1 million pier back in 26 or 27 that the Evening Independent pushed. Then it went down in 1968, and then there was a big debate about what to replace it with, and that's the current inverted pyramid that you see. And now we're seeing that debate all over again with what's going to happen next. I think to fully report this pier issue as it's going on right now, sometimes you almost have to look back at the previous ones in the 1970s, then in 1926, when there were those two piers both had a lot of controversial discussions surrounding them. So this is nothing new.
The other night I went to one of the city's open public forums for the pier, and I looked around the Coliseum, and maybe of the hundreds of people that were there were a lot of people there, maybe a dozen people under the age of 25. And that was very disappointing to me, because like I tell my students, whatever's going to be built, whatever they decide to do with that, the pier, or what they build on the water, will be the pier that you'll have for the rest of your life. And you'll be paying for it for the rest of your life. So you should have some say on what goes out on that water, because I'll be long gone before that thing comes down. There's always been a pier out there. There's always, whether it's the railroad pier, electric pier, fishing pier, municipal pier, $1 million pier, upside down pyramid pier. There's always been a pier out there. And you know, I feel personally that we need one. It is a focal point for the city. The rebirth of the downtown, the renaissance of Beach Drive and all the downtown has been tremendous. So to see this downtown is fabulous, the rebirth of downtown. The pier has to be the anchor of that. The pier has to be a major focal point for the city. And what it's going to look like, me, I'm a history guy. I want it to look like the $1 million pier. I want it to look, you know, Mediterranean Revival. I want it to look Vinoy-ish. I want it to look Spanish-ish. I want it to look like it belongs in St. Petersburg. But I also want to see all kinds of cool things out there. Because my biggest problem with the pier is, like, when you leave our building and you walk to the end of the pier, you see grass, sand, and water. And there's nothing else to do. I think there should be all kinds of activities leading all the way out to the head of the pier.
I am just really happy to think about St. Petersburg evolving in the way that it has.
St. Pete's history is fascinating, and it's something that we should all be appreciative of.